I remember the exact day everything changed. It was a Friday in late spring, and the air smelled of cut grass and distant lilacs. Normally, I savored that first real taste of the new season, but my mood was sour from the moment I woke up. I was already irritated that morning, thanks to a run-in with my boss about missed deadlines. The tension followed me all day like a stubborn shadow. There was nothing particularly ominous about that Friday, no thunderous skies, no gloom, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I sensed a discord I couldn't name. As I drove home, headlights slicing through the slowly encroaching dusk, I couldn't have guessed my life was about to detonate in a single, devastating moment. I noticed her car wasn't in the driveway. That part wasn't unusual. My wife, Janine, often went to the gym or stayed late at her office. We were both busy professionals, her in marketing, me in finance, and it wasn't abnormal for us to arrive home at staggered times. I let myself in quietly, half expecting to be greeted by the smell of dinner or the sound of her rummaging in the kitchen. But the house was silent. I called her name once, my voice echoing in the foyer, then shrugged to myself. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, trying to shake off the day's stress. Usually, Janine would text if she was going out for happy hour, but maybe she just lost track of time. She had a free-spirited streak, one of the things that first drew me to her. I remember glancing at the clock on the microwave, 7:48 p.m. She hadn't texted me in hours. A small niggle of worry tugged at me, but I brushed it off. People run late, especially on Fridays. I told myself not to be that paranoid spouse who demanded constant updates. Instead, I settled onto the sofa, clicked on the TV, and tried to focus on a baseball game. It wasn't until nearly 9 o'clock that my phone buzzed. I lunged for it, half anticipating a quick apology text from Janine, but it was only a coworker asking about a spreadsheet. Disappointed, I sent a curt reply and slumped deeper into the sofa. Another hour passed. I began to grow restless. She was never this late without a single word. Still, I forced myself to stay calm, flipping through pointless channels. By 10:30, I was pacing around the living room like a caged animal. Finally, around 11, her headlights swept through the blinds. Relief warred with a mounting aggravation. The garage door hummed open, and I heard her car pull in. I braced myself, uncertain whether to greet her with annoyance or concern. But as soon as I opened the kitchen door, something struck me as off. She stepped inside, breathless, a flush staining her cheeks. Her hair was tousled, as though someone had run fingers through it. She offered a quick smile that flickered like a faulty light bulb. "Sorry I'm late," she said, voice carrying a certain tightness. "Work stuff ran long, then I grabbed a drink with a colleague." She dropped her purse on the counter and sidestepped my gaze. I might have believed her, if not for the faintest hint of cologne on her blouse, definitely not her perfume, nor any I recognized as mine. A suspicious chill traveled down my spine, but I swallowed it. "You could have texted," I said, my tone more curt than I intended. She shrugged, saying her phone died. Glancing at her phone in her hand, I noticed it was lit up, battery icon healthy. But I kept silent. I didn't want to start an argument. Instead, I offered a stiff nod and turned away. She muttered something about being exhausted and disappeared into the bedroom. I stood there for several minutes, mind reeling. Had I jumped to conclusions? Perhaps she had used another phone charger on the drive home. But that cologne, someone else's scent, lingered on her clothes, and that knowledge buzzed in my brain like an angry wasp. Over the next few weeks, more small inconsistencies emerged. She started working late more often, took more showers right when she got home, and seemed protective of her phone in a way I'd never noticed before. We'd been married 7 years, and while I wouldn't call them perfect, they'd always felt secure. We had ups and downs, but we talked, we managed. This felt different. I'd ask if she wanted to watch a movie on a Tuesday night, and she'd blink at me as if I were intruding on some secret plan, then claim she had a headache or needed to finish a report. On the weekends, she was more distant, her gaze sliding away whenever I tried to meet her eyes. Eventually, one of those late-work excuses set my nerves ablaze. It was nearly midnight, and she still wasn't home. I sat in the living room, an untouched glass of whiskey on the table in front of me, staring at the door. My thoughts spiraled, images of her with someone else, locked in an embrace, doing things she once did only with me. At 12:27 a.m., she stumbled in, hair disheveled, eyes wide with guilt. I got stuck at the office, she claimed, reeking of cigarette smoke. She didn't smoke, nor did anyone at her office, as far as I knew. I asked what happened, pressing for details. She waved a dismissive hand, muttering about a coworker who smoked incessantly near her. But her words tumbled out in a rushed stammer. That night, I hardly slept, my heart pounding with a new, bitter certainty that something was very wrong. I decided to do what I once believed I would never do, snoop. It started with me checking her phone while she showered one evening. I felt slimy and desperate, but my curiosity won out. She'd changed her lock screen code. That alone sent a jolt of dread through me. We'd always had each other's passcodes, used each other's phones casually. Now, it was off limits. I tried a few possible combinations, her birthday, our anniversary, but none worked. My hands trembled with each failed attempt. I set the phone back where I found it, heart hammering in my chest. That was the night I accepted I needed more direct proof, for my own sanity if nothing else. A colleague of mine mentioned a private investigator, someone who specialized in marital suspicions. At first, I balked. Hiring a PI? It felt extreme, melodramatic. But the daily tension was wrecking my focus at work. I got the number, letting it sit in my desk drawer for a week, wrestling with my conscience. In the end, I called him. His name was Charles, a calm-voiced man who assured me he'd seen it all. I hated hearing myself describe my own wife as a potential cheat. I felt like I was betraying her somehow, even if she was the one betraying me. But once I started talking, the dam broke. I laid out all the suspicious details, the missed nights, the changes in her routine. Charles listened patiently, then said he'd tail her discreetly, gather evidence, and let me know. It was the single hardest call I'd ever made, and I hung up feeling dirty, yet also relieved. Finally, I was doing something about this hollow dread that gnawed at me. About a week later, Charles emailed me a file. I remember my heart practically seized up when I saw the message. I locked myself in the office at home and opened the attachment. It was a series of photos and time-stamped notes. There she was, my wife, stepping out of her car at a restaurant, smiling at a tall, dark-haired man in a tailored suit. They were standing too close, her hand brushing against his forearm with a familiarity that made my blood run cold. The notes detailed that they'd spent nearly 3 hours inside, left together, drove to a nearby motel, and emerged over 2 hours later. My hand shook so violently that I almost dropped my phone. The pictures were clear. The hugging, the way her body curved against him, there was no misreading it. I felt physically ill. For a moment, my vision blurred. All the nights I'd been home waiting, all the trust I'd had in her, all turned to ashes in a single horrifying revelation. I confronted her that same night. The rage and betrayal needed an outlet, and I didn't want to spend another minute pretending everything was normal. She got home around 8, and as soon as she walked in, I demanded, "Who is he?" My voice came out trembling with fury. She froze, eyes widening. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying for innocence. I showed her the pictures on my phone, the damning proof. She stared, color draining from her face, then muttered, "You're spying on me," as if that were the real crime. I shouted back, calling her out for her blatant lies. She stammered something about it being harmless, a mistake, that they had only gotten together for a few weeks, that she hadn't known how to tell me. My stomach churned. The betrayal felt like a physical weight on my chest. We fought for hours, voices escalating until my throat was raw. She cried, apologized, said she still loved me, that it was just an affair of convenience that got out of hand. I asked if she loved him. She shook her head, sobbing. No, it was never about love, she insisted. It was just exciting, and I felt stagnant at home. Hearing those words ripped my heart in half. I slept on the couch that night, though slept is the wrong word. I lay there in the dark, my thoughts spiraling. I'd caught her, I had proof, and now the question was what next? Divorce? Throw her out? Part of me wanted to do exactly that, to toss her clothes in the yard and slam the door in her face. Another part, still twisted with heartbreak, didn't know if I was ready to let go of the life we'd built. But the anger surged stronger the more I thought about it. She had humiliated me, lied to me for who knew how long. I felt an urge for revenge, something primal. Normally, I wasn't that kind of person, but in the rawness of that betrayal, I wanted her to hurt like I was hurting. I decided not to mention divorce yet. Instead, I pretended to be in shock, told her I needed time to think. She agreed, looking almost relieved I hadn't thrown her out immediately. Over the next few days, I discovered the true extent of her deceit. I found unexplained charges on our credit card, hotel receipts, gifts presumably for him. Each discovery lit my fury anew. We were both walking on eggshells, barely speaking unless absolutely necessary. At work, I was a zombie, replaying possible scenarios in my head. Part of me was fixated on how to get even, not just by leaving but by making sure she felt the full weight of her actions. The more I thought about revenge, the clearer my plan became. Janine prided herself on her social standing. She had a close-knit group of friends, a circle that adored her, or so they claimed. She was also deeply invested in her professional reputation, hoping to rise higher at her firm. She hated scandal and gossip. So I realized the worst blow to her ego might be public exposure. However, I also wanted to be smart about it. I wasn't looking for a messy meltdown that ended with me in trouble or a viral rant on social media. I wanted to ensure that she couldn't dodge the consequences, that her affair partner couldn't just fade into the background. Her lover, as I'd learned from Charles, was a man named Victor, a married executive from a neighboring firm, who apparently had his own secrets to keep. The wheels in my mind began to turn. One Friday, about 2 weeks after our confrontation, I told Janine I was attending a weekend conference in another city. She barely looked at me when I left, just muttered, "Have a safe trip." The conference was real enough, but I had no intention of actually staying there overnight. I showed my face for the morning seminars, then slipped out and drove back home in the late afternoon. Parking my car a few blocks away, I walked to the house, carefully letting myself in through the back door. My heart hammered, adrenaline surging as I crept upstairs. I prayed I wouldn't find something that would make me physically lose control, but a part of me expected it. Sure enough, muffled voices reached my ears from the bedroom. I couldn't decipher the exact words, but it was definitely her voice, and a deeper male tone responding. My blood roared in my ears. It was one thing to suspect, but actually hearing them in my own home. I paused at the threshold, swallowing my pounding heart, then nudged the door open. The scene that met me was exactly what I dreaded, yet almost expected. Janine and Victor, half-dressed, entangled on the bed that not long ago was the site of our marital intimacy. The moment froze like a twisted tableau. Janine let out a shriek, scrambling off the bed, eyes wild with panic. Victor nearly fell over himself trying to cover up. My vision narrowed. Rage flared, so potent I could taste it. But I forced myself to stay calm, if only barely. Janine started babbling, "It's not what it looks like, the most hollow cliché ever uttered. Victor stared at me, face pale as a ghost, obviously scrambling for an escape route. I held up my phone, its camera pointed right at them. I snapped a quick photo before they could react. Janine lunged to stop me, but I stepped back. "Don't you dare," she hissed, voice trembling. Victor tried to speak, his voice shaking. "Look, this is a misunderstanding," I cut him off with a cold laugh. "You're in my house, in my bed, with my wife, but sure, let's call it a misunderstanding." My mind raced, but I stuck to the plan I'd been formulating. Instead of screaming or attacking him, I calmly said, "Get out." He grabbed his clothes, hurriedly dressing. Janine stood there shaking, arms around her body, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please, let's talk," she whispered. I refused to meet her eyes. "I said get out," I repeated, my gaze fixed on Victor. He stumbled past me, reeking of sweat and cologne. The front door slammed behind him. Janine tried to approach me, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry, I swear I was about to break it off." I backed away, holding my phone up. "Save it. I've heard enough lies." She sobbed, her face twisted in desperation. But I stormed downstairs without another word, refusing to let her cling to me. The hollow feeling in my chest warred with the savage satisfaction that I'd caught them red-handed. That snapshot on my phone was going to be her downfall. We didn't speak for the rest of the night, and I didn't sleep in the house. I drove to a friend's place, letting him know I was in the middle of a major crisis. He didn't ask many questions, just offered his couch and a sympathetic ear. The next morning, I called the PI again and told him I needed contact information for Victor's wife. It took Charles a day to gather that info, but soon enough, I had her name, phone number, and email. Her name was Nadine, and from what Charles said, she was known in certain social circles for her philanthropic work. I felt an unholy pang of excitement at the prospect of informing her about the man she was married to. But I knew I should proceed carefully, or it could backfire. So I drafted a short, direct message. "Hello Nadine, I'm reaching out because your husband and my wife are having an affair. I have photographic evidence. I think you deserve to know. If you'd like to talk or meet, let me know." I reread it several times, my hands shaking, then hit send. Less than an hour later, Nadine called. Her voice was subdued, laced with confusion and dread. I confirmed my identity, told her the bare facts. She sounded stunned, then quietly asked if I could show her proof. We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a small cafe on the other side of town, where the likelihood of being recognized was minimal. That day, I felt a swirl of nerves and guilt. Even though I believed Nadine had a right to know, I hated being the messenger of such misery. But I couldn't back out. At the cafe, we recognized each other instantly, the two of us scanning the patrons with haunted expressions. She was elegantly dressed, her eyes puffy as though she'd been crying. I sat down across from her, my phone in hand. Without much preamble, I showed her the pictures, then described how I caught them in my own home. Tears welled up in her eyes. She stared at each photo as though trying to memorize every detail of her husband's betrayal. I felt a pang of sympathy. She was just another victim in this ugly mess. Eventually, she steeled herself, wiped her eyes, and whispered, I had suspicions, but seeing it is different. Thank you for telling me." She explained that Victor had been distant, traveling more often, with suspicious expenses. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but she hadn't expected this. We spent the next hour talking quietly, trading details, unsure how to proceed. A strange sense of camaraderie bloomed, two wounded spouses comparing notes on the same treacherous duo. I told her that while part of me wanted to blow this up publicly, I also wanted to be sure I handled it in a way that protected my own interests. She nodded, lips set in a grim line. "I'm going to consult a divorce lawyer," she said firmly. "I'm done with him." Her resolve impressed me. She then asked if I was divorcing Janine. I admitted I was strongly leaning that way, but part of my plan involved making Janine feel the consequences first. That plan took shape in the days that followed. While Janine begged for forgiveness at home, vacillating between tearful apologies and defensive anger, I started quietly disentangling my finances from hers. I opened a new bank account, moved half our joint savings discreetly, and made sure to gather all critical documents. We didn't have children, so that complication was off the table, but we did co-own the house. I also changed passwords on utility bills, our streaming services, anything that had my name primarily. It felt petty, but at the same time, I didn't want her or her affair partner to enjoy any comfort at my expense. Then came the matter of Janine's social circle. She had a circle of mutual friends, some of whom were couples we'd known for years. Others were her college friends or colleagues from work. A few days after our meeting, Nadine emailed me to say Victor had confessed everything, tried to spin it as a minor fling. She was furious. She told me that if I wanted to orchestrate a bigger reveal, she would back me. I realized that if I let Janine keep the affair hush-hush, she might salvage her standing among our friends and possibly her professional life. But if I was truly determined that she regret it forever, that meant stripping away the illusions she used to cloak her wrongdoing one evening. I told Janine I'd consider counseling. She jumped on the suggestion with a frantic hope. I insisted the first step was honesty. We should have a gathering with our friends and put everything on the table, I said. She blinked, confusion etched on her features. A gathering? Why? She asked. I feigned sincerity. If we want real support, let's tell our friends the truth of what's going on, so they understand the situation. She hesitated, obviously unnerved by the idea of going public. But I pressed, acting like it was the only way I could trust her sincerity. After a tense moment, she nodded, swallowing hard. She probably assumed she could spin the story or downplay her guilt. I reached out to our closest friends, told them we needed to talk about something important. I set a casual get-together for a Sunday afternoon at our place. That Sunday, I was a coil of tension, my nerves jangling. About a dozen people arrived, curiosity etched on their faces. Some brought wine or snacks, not sure what this was all about. Janine flitted around, forcing a smile. She'd done her hair and makeup meticulously, as if that could mask her dread. Once everyone settled, I cleared my throat, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "Thank you for coming," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've asked you here because something serious has happened, and we need your support and understanding." Janine shot me a panicked glance. I nodded toward her. "You want to start?" I asked, feigning politeness. Her lips trembled. She tried to speak, but her voice came out in a shaky mumble. We're going through a rough time." I could see she was stalling, hoping I'd soften the blow. But the past weeks of anguish had hardened me. Stepping forward, I pulled out my phone. "Actually, let me be direct," I said, voice cold. "Janine's been having an affair." Gasps rippled across the room. Janine paled, hands flying to her mouth. I clicked open a photo, the one I'd taken of them in bed, angled so it didn't reveal nudity but made it blatantly clear what was happening. I held it up for those nearby and offered to pass my phone around. A few of our friends looked horrified, others stared at Janine with shock. I felt a twisted satisfaction as she choked back a sob. I explained that I'd caught them, that it had been going on for months. One friend, Cassie, shook her head in disbelief, tears gathering in her eyes because she considered Janine a close friend. Another friend, Mike, just muttered curses under his breath, glaring at Janine as though she'd betrayed them all. Janine stood there, shaking, pinned by the crowd's attention. "This wasn't the way," she stammered, her voice cracking. I let her speak. She tried to stutter out apologies, claiming she never meant to hurt anyone, that she messed up. But the friends were stone-faced, stunned. The betrayal and my calm, methodical presentation of evidence left little room for sympathy. Some cast glances at me, clearly pained for my sake. One friend asked if we were divorcing. I shrugged. "I'm not sure yet," I said, though I knew in my heart that was almost certainly where this was headed. Janine looked like she wished she could sink into the floor. She'd lost the ability to spin a narrative. I took no joy in the emotional devastation this caused our friends, but I couldn't deny the grim satisfaction of seeing Janine's carefully curated image collapse around her. When everyone finally left, the house felt like a tornado had ripped through it. Janine sank onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. "How could you do that?" she wept. "You humiliated me." I stood across from her, arms folded. "You brought this on yourself," I replied, my voice devoid of pity. "I told you I wanted honesty." She stared at me, eyes brimming with anger and guilt. "I can't believe you'd be so cruel," she choked out. Part of me wanted to shout, "What about your cruelty? Sneaking another man into our bed?" But I bit my tongue. I simply turned away and went to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. She banged on it, sobbing for me to open, but I refused. Eventually, she gave up. The next day, she texted me repeatedly while I was at work, begging to talk, claiming I'd gone too far. I barely responded. Meanwhile, Nadine informed me via text that Victor was furious, claiming I'd orchestrated some scheme to ruin his life. He was apparently worried I might share the affair evidence with his workplace or with potential clients. Nadine was on the verge of filing divorce papers. A part of me wanted to escalate further, to ensure Victor suffered consequences too. But for the time being, humiliating him in front of his wife, and letting his own marriage implode, was enough. He knew I had the pictures. He'd live in fear that I might release them if he ever tried something vindictive. At home, Janine was a wreck. She tried apologizing, crying, blaming stress, anything to coax sympathy out of me. I held firm, unmoved. Privately, I arranged a consultation with a divorce lawyer. I gathered records showing her infidelity, which could be relevant in negotiations. When I finally told Janine, she broke down, sobbing that she was sorry, that she wanted to save the marriage, that she'd cut off all contact with Victor. I listened without emotion. "I'm not sure there's anything left to save," I said. Her tears redoubled. She asked if we could try therapy. I said it was too late for that. Maybe if she had come clean before I discovered it all on my own, I might have considered it. But her betrayal and the repeated lies had corroded everything. "You made your bed," I concluded, ironically echoing her literal choice. "Now you get to deal with the consequences." For the next few weeks, the house was a standoff. I was civil but distant. She wandered around like a ghost, desperately trying to cling to the life she'd obliterated. I filed for divorce, seeking to keep the house. My lawyer was quick to suggest that we might leverage the affair to negotiate better terms. In our state, infidelity can play a role in asset division. Janine seemed too numb or guilty to fight it. She asked if we could sell the house and split the money. I refused. I wanted her gone, forced to find somewhere else to live, a daily reminder of the life she'd forfeited. She moved out quietly one weekend while I was at work, leaving most of her things. The once vibrant home felt hollow, but at least I didn't have to see her face every morning, a constant reminder of betrayal. My revenge on Janine wasn't over the top or theatrical in a single blow, it was more a measured, thorough dismantling of her illusions. She lost many of our mutual friends, who sided with me when the full story came out. Her mother, who once doted on her, expressed deep disappointment and called to apologize to me, a twisted reversal I never could have predicted. Janine's workplace gossip churned with whispers that she'd had an affair with a married businessman. Though no official action was taken against her, her reputation was undeniably tarnished. Whatever future promotions or alliances she hoped to cultivate became more complicated, her credibility stained by the scandal. Perhaps it wasn't fair that personal matters bled into her professional sphere, but she had gambled her marriage on a fling and lost. Actions have consequences. I heard from a friend that she ended up crashing on a colleague's couch for a while, too ashamed to face her family. As for Victor, last I knew, Nadine served him divorce papers, and he was scrambling to protect his finances. She cut him off from most joint assets, took the kids, and threatened to expose him to his firm if he tried to shortchange her in the settlement. My silent alliance with Nadine had worked perfectly. He, too, was left with a tarnished name and an empty bed. It gave me a grim sense of satisfaction to realize that Janine's fling was never going to become some romantic happily ever after. In the quiet weeks after she left, I tried to process my new normal. Waking up alone in the house felt both liberating and painfully sad. 7 years of marriage, gone in a whirlwind. Sometimes, I hated myself for orchestrating such a public takedown. Had I gone too far? But then I'd remember walking into my bedroom, seeing her and Victor entwined, or the months she lied directly to my face, and the doubt faded. She had inflicted a deep wound, and while my actions may have been ruthless, I refused to feel guilty for ensuring she faced real consequences. Anyone who glimpsed the darkest corners of betrayal might understand why I did what I did. The divorce process moved faster than I'd expected. Because Janine didn't contest most terms, and we had no kids, we resolved the property division in just a few months. The house stayed with me, as I demanded. She got a modest settlement from the leftover savings, enough to start fresh somewhere else. She insisted on meeting me one final time before the papers were signed. Against my better judgment, I agreed to a public meeting at a diner. She arrived looking exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. She was still beautiful in a melancholic way, a shell of the vibrant woman I once knew. We sat across from each other, the hum of other patrons filling the silence. She sipped a coffee, eyes flicking to my face. "I just wanted to say," she began, voice trembling, "I'm sorry. Truly. Not just for the affair, but for everything else, how I lied, how I disrespected our marriage." A tear slid down her cheek. "I know you'll never forgive me, but I had to tell you how terrible I feel." I nodded, my throat tight. I didn't relish her tears the way I might have expected. Instead, I felt a strange mixture of pity and lingering anger. "I loved you," I said softly, unsure if it was a statement of fact or an accusation. She wiped her face, nodding. "I know. And I loved you too, in my own messed up way. I got restless. I never meant to lose you." The words hung in the air, too little, too late. We talked for a few more minutes, going in circles about how it all fell apart. Eventually, I paid for her coffee, left a tip, and walked out without looking back. That was the final time I saw her in person. The official divorce was finalized soon after. My lawyer informed me that Janine had signed everything, no further delays. I felt a strange hollowness that night, a swirl of relief and sorrow. It wasn't a victory celebration, my marriage had ended, after all, but I had at least reclaimed my dignity in the face of her betrayal. In the weeks that followed, I started slowly adjusting to single life. I took down photos of us, stored them in a box in the attic, repainted the bedroom to erase that memory. I even adopted a dog from the local shelter, a big rescue mutt named Harvey who greeted me each day with enthusiastic tail wags. That helped the house feel less empty, gave me a reason to get outside for walks, step by step rebuilding my routine without Janine. Word of my public reveal circulated among old friends for a while, leading to gossip and speculation. A few people reached out, asking for the full story. I gave them a condensed version, not reveling in the spectacle as much as I once thought I would. Sometimes, revenge tastes sweet at first, then leaves a bitter aftertaste. But I never truly regretted making her face the consequences. She had disrespected me, lied to me, violated the sanctity of our marriage in my own home. If that wasn't enough cause for a harsh response, I don't know what would be. Eventually, the gossip died down. People moved on to new dramas, new stories, and my own life began to focus on the future rather than the past. Months rolled by. Nadine and I kept in sporadic contact via text, checking in on each other's post-divorce progress. She finalized her own split from Victor, and from what she said, he was now living alone in a small apartment, stripped of most of his assets. It turned out Nadine had a fierce legal team. She thanked me once for giving her the push she needed to stop making excuses for his behavior. Funny how our misguided spouses ended up uniting us, if only briefly, in a shared mission to undo their betrayal. We never met again in person, but there was a quiet camaraderie in knowing we'd each survived a storm. Eventually, I found a new normal. I threw myself into work, picking up new responsibilities, investing in my career the way I once invested in my marriage. Outside of work, I reconnected with old friends I'd neglected over the years. I even started seeing a therapist, discovering how anger and hurt can fester if unaddressed. Bit by bit, I let go of the bitterness. I couldn't forget what she did, but I accepted that it was part of my story now, a scar that shaped me. The sense of betrayal softened with time, replaced by a more measured perspective. I wouldn't say I was grateful for the experience, but I understood that I learned a harsh lesson about trust and boundaries. A year after the divorce, on a cool autumn day, I received an unexpected text from Janine. It was a short note saying she hoped I was doing okay, that she was sorry for all the pain she caused, and that she'd finally found an apartment of her own. She also mentioned she lost her job, though she didn't give details. I stared at the message, my emotions churning. Part of me wanted to ask for details, how she was managing, whether she still spoke to Victor, if she regretted it every day. Another part of me wanted no contact. In the end, I replied simply, "I'm fine. I wish you the best." I had no desire to rekindle any connection. She'd made her bed, and from what I could gather, it wasn't a comfortable one. Some nights, I'd lie awake in bed, Harvey snoring on the floor, and think about how drastically life had changed. If I was honest, a small piece of me still grieved for the good times Janine and I shared. Before the lies, before the betrayal, we'd had genuine moments of laughter, love, and excitement. But the memory of walking in on her and Victor overshadowed all of that. The rage I felt back then had cooled, replaced by a quiet resolution that I did what needed to be done. She had made her choices, and I had responded in a way that ensured she would never brush it off as a minor transgression. Over the following months, I continued working on myself, took up running, improved my cooking skills, enjoyed the solitude of a house that was entirely mine. Slowly, my mind stopped gravitating to the question of, why did she do it, or, could I have prevented it? Instead, I focused on, what can I do next? I contemplated dating again someday, though the idea of trust still felt fragile. But there was no rush. I had time, and I had peace. Looking back, I sometimes questioned the harshness of my method, public humiliation among our friends, ensuring her social and professional standing took a hit. Yet, each time I recalled the weeks of deception, the nights she crawled into our bed after being with him, I felt a steely conviction that she deserved the fallout. If not for the pictures, she might have gaslighted me, insisting I was paranoid. If not for me confronting them in my own house, she might have carried on in secret for who knew how long. And if not for me exposing her publicly, she might have simply hopped to another social circle unscathed. Regret it forever? Perhaps that was dramatic. But I wanted her to feel a fraction of the pain I'd endured. I don't know where Janine is now. The last I heard through a mutual acquaintance was that she was doing freelance marketing, living in a small apartment, and staying mostly to herself. She apparently lost a large portion of her former support network. Her best friend Cassie tried to remain neutral at first, but the emotional upheaval proved too big. Now, Cassie and I still speak occasionally, and she says Janine is lonely, sometimes calling late at night to lament how everything turned out. While part of me empathizes with her sense of loss, another part firmly believes that heartbreak was the price of betrayal. I never wanted to become vindictive, but once she crossed that line in our marriage, I saw no reason to cushion the landing for her. In quiet moments, I sometimes imagine an alternate universe where she confided in me before straying, where we tackled our marital issues openly. Maybe we would have found solutions, or maybe we would have parted amicably. But that wasn't our path. She chose secrecy and betrayal, forcing me to respond in kind. People may judge my actions harshly, some might say I stooped to her level. But I refuse to apologize for refusing to be a victim. I gave her trust and loyalty for years, and she stomped all over it with a smug sense of entitlement. I recall the day I finally signed the final divorce decree, pen scratching across the paper. My hand didn't even tremble. The calm that washed over me was staggering. I remember thinking, this is it. She no longer has any hold on my life. I walked out of the lawyer's office, the afternoon sun warm on my face. Despite the remnants of anger and sadness, I felt something like a new chapter opening before me. I had no illusions that the next steps would be easy, but they would be mine, untainted by lies. If there's one lesson I carried forward, it's that sometimes you have to burn bridges to save yourself from further harm. I never sought to be cruel for cruelty's sake. I only wanted to ensure she and her affair partner couldn't laugh behind my back, enjoying the spoils of their deception while I pretended ignorance. I wanted them to truly feel the weight of their betrayal. In the end, I believe I accomplished that. The quiet finality of Janine's life now, overshadowed by her own bad decisions, is proof enough that she regrets what she did. And if my own conscience sometimes pricks me about the severity of my retaliation, I remind myself how profoundly she violated my trust, my home, my sense of security. These days, I focus on the simpler things in life: a quiet morning run before work, a decent cup of coffee, a meaningful chat with an old friend. The bitterness has largely receded, replaced by a cautious optimism. I still feel the faint burn of betrayal if I dwell on it, but more often than not, I choose not to. I have a chance to rebuild, with no illusions about how fragile trust can be. Someday, I might even open my heart to someone new. If that happens, I'll carry with me the knowledge that betrayal is always a possibility, but so is loyalty, if nurtured properly. I won't let her actions define my future, even if they shaped my past. And so, I live on. I keep the evidence of her affair tucked away in a digital folder, mostly ignored. I could delete it, but part of me wants to remember what I overcame. It's a relic of a time when heartbreak and anger propelled me to transform my life, a time I made her regret it forever. Perhaps that's my final act of power, not letting her memory dominate me, but keeping it as a footnote in my story, a warning, a lesson, and a testament to my resilience. Life goes on, and in that steady, unrelenting march forward, I find my peace. No matter how deep the wound, healing can follow. And though I once believed my life was shattered beyond repair, I stand here now, stronger and wiser, having ensured that I was not the only one bearing the weight of her betrayal.